The scarred duke promised her revenge, and placed a fortune in her trembling hands. But the price was unthinkable. A child conceived in secrecy, born into the palace's dark corridors, and destined to be hidden from the world before the crown discovered the truth. The mathematics of ruin were always exact. Clara Hartwell had learned this truth not in the schoolroom where she once sat as a child, but in the cold parlor of her father's decaying estate, where creditors' letters arrived with the regularity of seasonal rain. She sat now at the narrow writing desk, her fingers stiff with cold despite the thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, calculating figures that refused to balance no matter how she arranged them. 23 pounds. That was what remained of the Hartwell fortune, if one could call it fortune. The governess position she held at the Middleton household paid 18 pounds annually, barely enough to cover the interest on debts her father had accumulated through a combination of poor investments and poorer judgment. The viscountcy meant nothing when the land had been mortgaged twice over, when the townhouse stood empty because they could not afford to heat more than 2 rooms. Clara pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose, willing away the headache that had become her constant companion. She was 26 years old, unremarkably pretty in a way that attracted no particular attention, and possessed of an intellect that had proven to be both blessing and curse. Intelligence without means was merely another form of poverty. It allowed you to see your descent with perfect clarity. The door opened without ceremony. Amelia entered, 16 and still somehow untouched by the grimness that had settled over their lives like coal dust. Her sister carried a tea tray with the careful dignity their mother had taught them both, back when such gestures had meant something other than pretense. Mr. Hendricks came by again, Amelia said quietly, setting the tray down. Father sent him away, but he'll return tomorrow. Clara's hand stilled on the ledger. Hendricks. The name tasted of ash in her mouth. He was 53, a widower with grown children and interests that had fixed themselves on Amelia with the persistence of rot spreading through wood. He had money. He had respectability. He had offered a settlement that would clear the Hartwell debts entirely. Did father? Clara could not finish the question. He has not agreed yet. Amelia's voice remained steady, but her hands betrayed her, gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. But he will. We both know he will. They sat in silence, sisters separated by 7 years and united by the understanding that their lives were currencies in a transaction neither had chosen. Clara had already sacrificed her youth to work, to managing their father's decline, to shielding Amelia from the worst of it. But there were limits even to sacrifice. Hendricks would not be denied indefinitely. The knock at the door came as an interruption to despair. Mrs. Pemberton, their housekeeper, the single remaining servant they could afford, appeared in the doorway with an expression of cautious surprise. "A Mr. Thomas Whitmore to see you, Miss Clara. He says it's a matter of business. Private business." Clara exchanged glances with Amelia. They received no visitors, had no business worth conducting. Still she nodded. What harm could come that had not already taken root? The man who entered was perhaps 40, dressed in the somber attire of a solicitor, his face remarkable only in its careful neutrality. He carried a leather case and an air of discretion so pronounced it was almost tangible. "Miss Hartwell." He bowed slightly. "Thank you for receiving me. I come on behalf of a client who wishes to extend a proposal, one that requires absolute confidentiality." Clara gestured to the chair across from her. "I have little time for mystery, Mr. Whitmore. State your business plainly." Something flickered in his expression. Approval, perhaps. "My client is willing to pay £5 merely for you to travel north and hear an offer. The journey will take 3 days. All expenses will be covered. You need commit to nothing beyond listening. £5. The sum hung in the air between them, impossible and necessary. £5 would buy them weeks, perhaps a month more before decisions became inevitable. "Why me?" Clara asked. "I am nobody of consequence. My client believes otherwise." Whitmore withdrew a sealed envelope from his case, placing it on the desk. "Inside are travel arrangements and a letter of introduction. If you accept, a carriage will arrive tomorrow at dawn. If you decline, consider the £5 payment for your discretion regarding this conversation." He stood, leaving the envelope where it lay like a seed that might grow into salvation or something far more complicated. "One more thing, Miss Hartwell." Whitmore paused at the door. "My client's offer is honorable. Unusual but honorable. Whatever you may hear in the north, remember that." After he left, Clara stared at the envelope for a long time. Amelia moved to stand beside her, one hand resting lightly on Clara's shoulder. "You'll go," Amelia said. It was not a question. "Yes." Clara broke the seal. I'll go. There was no alternative. There was never any alternative when the mathematics of ruin were this exact. The journey north stripped away what remained of Clara's illusions about the world beyond her narrow existence. 3 days in a well-appointed carriage, traveling through landscapes that transformed from the managed countryside of the home counties into something wilder, more austere. The driver spoke little, the stops were brief and efficient, and Clara found herself suspended between the life she knew and whatever waited at journey's end. She had told her father only that a temporary position had presented itself, work that paid well enough to justify the absence. He had barely looked up from his brandy, waving her away with the vague gesture of a man who had long since surrendered agency over his own household. Amelia had helped her pack the single trunk that contained everything Clara owned worth carrying: 2 serviceable dresses, her mother's pearls, a book of poetry she could not bear to leave behind. On the 3rd afternoon, the landscape opened onto moorland, vast and colorless under February skies. In the distance, a house emerged, though house was an insufficient word for what Clara saw. It was a monument in stone, a statement of power made architectural. Wings extended from a central block in perfect symmetry, windows reflecting the gray sky like watchful eyes. The ground stretched in all directions, ordered and immense. The carriage rolled through iron gates bearing a crest Clara did not recognize. A raven and a sword crossed. They passed tenant cottages that looked well-maintained, fields lying fallow for winter, a church with a bell tower that pierced the low clouds. This was not merely an estate. This was a world unto itself, governed by laws Clara did not yet understand. The carriage stopped before the main entrance. A footman appeared immediately, too well trained to show surprise at her modest appearance. Mr. Whitmore descended from a second carriage that had followed at a distance. Additional propriety, Clara realized, so she would not travel entirely alone with a man. Miss Hartwell. Whitmore offered his hand to help her down. Welcome to Blackwood Hall. Blackwood. The name meant something, Clara was certain, though she could not immediately place it. Inside, the entrance hall soared 2 stories high, floored in black and white marble, dominated by a staircase that curved upward with mathematical precision. Portraits lined the walls, generations of stern-faced men and elegant women, all bearing variations of the same dark eyes and proud carriage. A housekeeper appeared, older than Mrs. Pemberton, her face carved from years of service into something both severe and knowing. Mrs. Dawson, Whitmore said by way of introduction. She will show you to your rooms. You'll have time to refresh yourself before dinner, when His Grace will receive you. His Grace. The title landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of understanding through Clara's mind. A duke. She had been summoned by a duke. The impossibility of it threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to breathe, to maintain the composure that had carried her through years of managing impossible situations. The rooms she was given were larger than the entire floor of her father's townhouse. A bedroom, a sitting room, all appointed with the kind of quiet luxury that spoke of wealth so old it need not announce itself. A fire blazed in the hearth. Her trunk had already been unpacked, her 2 dresses hanging in a wardrobe that could have held 50. Clara stood at the window, looking out over gardens rendered geometric by winter and distance. What could a duke possibly want from her? The question circled through her mind, finding no purchase. She was nobody. Worse than nobody, she was the daughter of a failed viscount, a woman who worked for her living, who carried no connections worth cultivating. A knock at the door. A maid entered, young and carefully neutral in expression. His Grace asks that you join him in the library at 6 o'clock, miss. I'm to help you dress if you'll permit. Clara wanted to laugh. She had 2 dresses. One she wore, one remained. There was no choosing involved. But she allowed the maid to help her change, to arrange her hair in a style slightly more elegant than the severe knot she usually wore. When she looked in the mirror, she saw what she always saw. A woman of no particular distinction, her best feature being eyes that saw too much and revealed too little. At precisely 6 o'clock, a footman led her through corridors lined with more portraits, more evidence of lineage and consequence. The library, when they reached it, was a room designed for serious thought. Books filled every wall from floor to ceiling, the kind of collection that represented generations of accumulated knowledge. A fire burned low in the grate. Lamps cast warm light across leather chairs and a massive desk. The man who stood at the window did not turn immediately when she entered. He was tall, his figure outlined against the last gray light of day, one hand resting on the window frame in a posture that suggested both weariness and watchfulness. Miss Hartwell. His voice was cultured, controlled, bearing the weight of authority worn so long it had become natural. Thank you for coming. He turned then, and Clara understood immediately why he had chosen to receive her in lamplight, why he stood partially in shadow. The left side of his face was marked by a scar that ran from temple to jaw, the kind of injury that spoke of violence survived. His left hand, she noticed, was missing 2 fingers. Waterloo. The word came to her unbidden. This was a man who had purchased his position not merely through birth, but through sacrifice measured in flesh. Your Grace. Clara curtsied, neither too deep nor too shallow. Mr. Whitmore said you had a proposal. I confess myself bewildered as to what service I might possibly provide. Something flickered across his face, appreciation perhaps for her directness. Then let us dispense with preliminaries, Miss Hartwell. I need an heir. You need money. I propose we negotiate the terms by which both needs might be met. The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their clarity. Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet, though she did not move. I see, she said quietly. You are looking for a broodmare who understands she is bought. I am looking, he replied, his voice unchanged, for a woman intelligent enough to understand what I am offering, and desperate enough to accept it. Clara did not flinch. She had learned long ago that survival required the ability to hear terrible truths without collapsing beneath their weight. She moved further into the room, positioning herself where the lamplight would fall equally on both their faces. If this conversation was to be conducted in brutal honesty, let it at least be conducted as equals in visibility. Then you have investigated me thoroughly, she said. You know about my father's debts. About Amelia. About Mr. Hendricks. I know that you have been managing an impossible situation with remarkable competence for 3 years. The Duke, she did not yet know his given name, moved away from the window, crossing to a sideboard where he poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if she wanted one. I know that you work as a governess not because you enjoy instructing spoiled children in mediocre watercolors, but because it was the only respectable option available. I know that within 6 weeks, perhaps 8, your father will agree to sell your sister to a man who collects young wives the way some men collect paintings. He handed her a glass. Clara took it, her fingers steady despite the anger rising in her throat. Anger not at him but at the accuracy of his assessment. And you believe this makes me susceptible to your proposal, she said. I believe this makes you practical enough to hear it without indulging in false outrage. He gestured to the chairs near the fire. After a moment's hesitation, Clara sat. He took the chair opposite, leaning back in a posture that might have seemed relaxed if not for the tension visible in his shoulders. I am dying, Miss Hartwell. Not today, perhaps not this year, but soon enough that time has become a currency I can no longer afford to spend carelessly. Clara studied him. He appeared to be perhaps 30, though the scar aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. His eyes were gray, intelligent, and profoundly weary. What is the nature of your illness? She asked. The physicians use elaborate terms that mean very little. What matters is that I have perhaps 2 years, perhaps less. What also matters is that if I die without an heir, everything I govern passes to my cousin Malcolm. His mouth twisted slightly around the name. A man who views the people on these lands as resources to be extracted rather than lives to be protected. Surely you could marry, Clara said. A duke would have no shortage of suitable candidates. Marriage requires time I do not have. It requires courtship, negotiation between families, settlements that take months to arrange. It requires producing an heir who is unquestionably legitimate, which means witnesses, announcements, the scrutiny of society and crown. He took a drink of his wine, his expression darkening. It also requires that I subject some well-bred young woman to the prospect of immediate widowhood and the probable attentions of Malcolm afterward. I find I am not quite that cruel. But you find yourself cruel enough for this? Clara said quietly. I find myself desperate enough for this. He leaned forward, his gaze direct. I am offering you money, Miss Hartwell. Enough to clear your father's debts entirely. Enough to provide Amelia with a dowry that will allow her to choose her own husband. Enough to give you an income of £200 annually for the rest of your life, regardless of what transpires. £200? Clara's mind converted the sum automatically into what it meant. Security, independence, freedom from the constant calculation of survival. It was more than generous. It was transformative. In exchange for what, precisely? She forced herself to ask the question clinically, as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than the use of her body. A child. Conceived in secret, born in secret, raised here under my protection. He spoke with the same clinical precision. The arrangement would be presented as a marriage. There would be a ceremony, properly legal, properly witnessed by a select few who can be trusted. You would be the Duchess of Blackwood in fact and law. But the marriage would remain unknown to society at large until after the child is born, at which point it would be announced as having occurred quietly some months prior. And when you die? You would remain Duchess, with full authority over the estate until the child reaches majority. You would have governance, Miss Hartwell. Real power, not the decorative kind. The management of these lands, the welfare of the people who live on them, the direction of considerable resources, all of it would be yours to administer. Clara set down her wine glass with careful precision. Why me? Surely there are women of better birth, better connections, who would accept such terms. Better birth means more questions, more scrutiny, more risk that the secret would be exposed before the child is old enough to be protected by law and established fact. He paused, choosing his words with visible care. I need someone intelligent enough to manage what I am building, strong enough to withstand Malcolm's inevitable challenges, and invisible enough that society will not look too closely until it is too late to matter. I need someone who understands that power is responsibility, not ornament. You need someone desperate, Clara corrected. Yes, he agreed without hesitation. I need someone desperate enough to accept impossible terms, and competent enough to survive them. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Clara found herself thinking not of herself but of Amelia, of her sister's hands gripping the desk, of the resignation already settling into her young face. She thought of her father, drowning slowly in brandy and failure. She thought of the narrow room where she slept in the Middleton household, of years stretching ahead in service to other people's children, other people's lives. I would be treated as your wife, she said finally. Not as a vessel. Not as something to be used and discarded. You would be my wife, he replied. In law and in truth. What I am proposing is unorthodox, Miss Hartwell, but it is not dishonorable. Your Grace. Alaric. The name emerged quietly. If we are to do this, you should know my name. Alaric, she repeated, tasting the formality of it. You understand that what you are asking is impossible. That it requires me to become someone else entirely. A duchess. I would not know how to be such a person. Neither did I know how to be a duke when my father died and left me this. He gestured vaguely at the room, at the weight of everything beyond it. One learns, or one fails. I am offering you the chance to learn. Clara stood, moving to the window where he had stood earlier. Outside, darkness had settled completely over the grounds. Somewhere in that darkness were villages, farms, lives dependent on whoever governed here. She thought of Malcolm, a name spoken with such careful distaste. She thought of what it meant to be offered power, real power, in exchange for bearing a child she would then be permitted to raise. I have one condition, she said, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. The child is mine. Not just legally but truly. I will not bear a son or daughter only to have them taken from me or treated as merely the next piece in your family's dynasty. If I do this, I am their mother, with all the authority and love that word entails. She turned to face him, expecting negotiation, perhaps resistance. Instead, she saw something unexpected in his scarred face: relief. That, Alaric Blackwood said quietly, is precisely what I hoped you would demand. The marriage took place 4 days later in the private chapel at Blackwood Hall, witnessed by exactly 5 people: Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Dawson the housekeeper, the Duke's personal physician Dr. Garrett, a minister brought from a neighboring parish who asked no questions when offered sufficient coin, and a silent older gentleman introduced only as Lord Pemberton, whom Clara understood to be one of Alaric's few trusted allies. Clara wore a dress Mrs. Dawson had produced from somewhere in the vast household, pale gray silk that had belonged to Alaric's mother, altered hastily to fit Clara's smaller frame. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. The ceremony lasted perhaps 10 minutes, the words pronounced in the minister's perfunctory tone suggesting he had performed the ritual so many times it had lost all meaning beyond legal necessity. When Alaric placed the ring on her finger, a heavy gold band set with a single dark sapphire, Clara felt the weight of it as both protection and prison. She was a duchess now. The thought seemed absurd, impossible, yet the ring testified to its truth. You may kiss your bride, your grace, the minister said, and Clara saw Alaric hesitate, perhaps the first moment of uncertainty she had witnessed from him. She solved the problem by offering her hand instead. He took it, bowing slightly over her fingers in a gesture that acknowledged both the formality of the moment and the strangeness of their arrangement. Afterward, papers were signed. Mr. Whitmore had prepared documents with the thoroughness of a man who understood that details determine destinies. The marriage certificate, the settlement agreements, the establishment of Clara's income. All of it recorded in precise legal language that transformed spoken promises into binding obligation. The sum we discussed has been transferred to cover your father's debts, Whitmore said quietly as Clara signed her new name for the first time, Clara Blackwood. The letters looked foreign, as if someone else had written them. I have also arranged for your sister to be enrolled at Mrs. Ashford's Academy in Bath, a respectable institution where she will be safely away from London and Mr. Hendricks. The fees are paid for 3 years. Clara's hand trembled slightly. Thank you. Thank His Grace, Whitmore replied. I merely execute his instructions. A wedding breakfast followed, though calling it such felt generous. Cold meats, bread, wine consumed in the formal dining room at a table that could have seated 40. The 5 witnesses ate in uncomfortable silence, the weight of shared secrecy binding them together in conspiracy. Clara understood that each of these people now carried knowledge that could destroy what had been built today. Their loyalty had been purchased, or in Mrs. Dawson's case, earned through decades of service, but loyalty was never absolutely certain. When the meal ended, the witnesses departed. Lord Pemberton clasped Alaric's shoulder briefly, the gesture conveying something beyond words. Dr. Garrett reminded Alaric to take the evening tonic, his tone carrying the particular authority of a physician who has treated a patient long enough to transcend formal boundaries. Then they were gone, and Clara found herself alone with her husband in a house that seemed to expand in the silence, its corridors and rooms suddenly infinite. I should show you the administrative offices, Alaric said, his voice careful, formal. If you are to govern here, you must understand what requires governing. Clara followed him through the house, through doors she had not yet passed. He brought her to a suite of rooms on the ground floor, an office dominated by a desk covered in ledgers and correspondence, adjoining rooms filled with filing cabinets and document boxes organized with military precision. This is the estate management, Alaric explained, gesturing to the ledgers. Rents, expenditures, wages for staff and tenants, maintenance schedules. Here, he pulled out a drawer, are the maps. Every property, every field, every structure. And here, another drawer, contracts with tenants, employment agreements, records of disputes and their resolutions. He spent 2 hours walking her through the systems he had built, explaining not just what existed but why it existed. Clara listened with the focused attention she had once brought to her father's accounts, but this was different in scale and complexity. This was not merely survival arithmetic. This was the machinery of power made tangible. The tenants meet with us now, on the first Monday of each month, Alaric continued. Grievances, proposals, requests for assistance. Some of the older families have been on this land for 200 years. They remember every promise made, every promise broken. And Malcolm? Clara asked. Does he involve himself in these matters? Alaric's expression hardened. Malcolm has his own estates in the south, which he manages through intermediaries while spending most of his time in London cultivating political connections. He views land as wealth to be extracted, not as responsibility. When I die, if he inherits, he will install a steward who will maximize profit without regard for the people who actually work these fields. Then we must ensure he does not inherit. Clara moved to the desk, running her fingers along the edge of a ledger. What are the vulnerabilities? What could he use to challenge the succession? Alaric studied her for a long moment. The marriage must remain secret until after the child is born and registered. If it becomes known too early, questions will be asked about the timing, about whether the child is legitimate. Malcolm has allies in Parliament, connections to families who would welcome any excuse to intervene in Blackwood affairs. Because of your reclusiveness. Because of my face. He said it without self-pity, merely as fact. After Waterloo, I withdrew from society. That withdrawal has been interpreted as weakness, instability. There are those who believe a scarred duke is unsuitable to manage significant holdings, that the title should pass to someone more presentable. Clara felt anger kindle in her chest, not at him but at a world that measured worth by appearance rather than action. Then we have approximately 9 months to ensure that by the time Malcolm learns of this marriage, it will be too late to challenge it effectively. Yes. Alaric moved to stand beside her at the desk. Which means you must learn everything. The accounts, the tenants, the politics, the alliances. You must become indispensable not just legally but practically. When I die, there must be no question that you are the only person capable of managing what has been built here. When do we begin? Clara asked. We already have, Alaric replied. He pulled out a document from one of the drawers, a thick packet of papers bound in leather. This is the foundation. Administrative procedures, legal precedents, coded instructions for various contingencies. Whitmore and I have been building this framework for 2 years. Clara took the packet, opened it, and began to read. The first few pages appeared routine: procedures for estate management, protocols for tenant relations. But as she read deeper, she began to see something else. Layers of meaning embedded in seemingly mundane language, clauses that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on context, legal structures designed to protect against challenges she had not yet considered. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "This is not just estate management. This is a complete system of governance designed to function regardless of who holds the title." "Yes." Alaric's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "That is precisely what it is. And that, Clara, is why I chose you. Because I knew you would see it." She looked up at him, this scarred stranger who was now her husband, who had offered her power and expected her to wield it competently. For the first time since accepting his proposal, Clara felt something beyond desperation and determination. She felt the stirring of possibility. "Then let us begin properly," she said. "Show me everything." The first month of marriage passed in a strange suspension of ordinary time. Clara and Alaric existed in parallel routines that intersected only in the administrative offices and the library, spaces where the work of governance created a neutral ground between them. They communicated primarily through written notes left on the desk, queries about tenant requests, questions regarding legal precedents, observations about expenditures that required explanation. Clara discovered that she possessed an aptitude for administration that had been starved by years of managing mere survival. Here she could think in larger patterns, could see how decisions in one area cascaded into effects elsewhere. She reorganized the filing system, cross-referencing documents in ways that made information more accessible. She identified expenditures that seemed excessive and traced them back to their sources, finding inefficiencies that had persisted simply because no one had questioned them. Alaric watched this transformation with something that might have been approval, though his natural reserve made such assessments difficult. He began leaving her more complex problems: disputes between tenants, requests for infrastructure improvements, decisions about crop rotation and land use. Each time, Clara would study the issue from multiple angles before presenting her recommendation. More often than not, Alaric would simply nod and tell her to proceed. "You do not need my permission," he said one evening as they worked side by side in the office, the spring rain pattering against the windows. "You are the Duchess. Your authority here is equal to mine." "In law, perhaps," Clara replied, not looking up from the ledger she was reviewing. "In practice, these people have known you for years. I am still a stranger." "Then let us remedy that." Alaric set down his pen. "Tomorrow we visit the tenants. Not for the monthly meeting but informally. I want them to see you, to understand that you are not merely decorative." The next morning dawned clear, the rain having washed the landscape clean. Clara dressed in practical clothing. Mrs. Dawson had quietly arranged for a wardrobe more suited to a duchess, though Clara had insisted on functionality over fashion. They rode out on horseback, Alaric on a black gelding, Clara on a gentler mare that nonetheless had spirit enough to be interesting. The estate was larger than Clara had grasped from maps alone. They rode for an hour before reaching the first tenant farm, a sturdy stone structure surrounded by fields that showed signs of careful management. The farmer, a man named John Carver with weathered hands and sharp eyes, came out to greet them with a respect that seemed genuine rather than merely obligatory. "Your Grace," he said to Alaric, then turned to Clara with visible curiosity. "Your Grace." "Mr. Carver," Alaric said. "I wanted to introduce my wife properly. The Duchess will be taking a more active role in estate management." Something passed across Carver's face: assessment, calculation, perhaps a degree of skepticism. "Is that so?" "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but do you know anything about farming?" Clara could have been offended. Instead, she found herself appreciating the directness. "Very little, Mr. Carver. Which is why I hope you and the other tenants will be patient with my questions. I understand you recently requested funds for drainage improvements in the lower fields." "Aye." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Been asking for 3 years. The water sits there every spring, drowns half the crop before it can take root." "I read your proposals," Clara said. "All 3 of them. Each more detailed than the last. I wonder why they were declined." Carver glanced at Alaric, then back to Clara. "Expense, I was told. Other priorities. May I see the fields in question?" They walked the land, Carver explaining the drainage problem with the expertise of someone who had worked this soil for decades. Clara asked questions, taking mental notes, seeing how the water flowed and where it pooled. When they returned to the farmhouse, Carver's wife had brought out tea and bread, an offering that Clara accepted with genuine gratitude. "The expense is justified," Clara said to Alaric as they rode toward the next farm. "The drainage improvement would pay for itself within 2 harvests, and the long-term benefit to soil quality is significant." "I know," Alaric replied. "I approved it yesterday after you flagged it in your review. The work begins next week." Clara turned to stare at him. "You might have mentioned that before we visited. I wanted Carver to hear it from you. I wanted him to understand that when you ask questions, decisions follow." He met her gaze directly. "You are not merely learning, Clara. You are already governing. The sooner everyone understands that, the better." They visited 4 more farms that day, each interaction following a similar pattern. Alaric introduced her, stepped back, allowed Clara to engage directly with the tenants. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and by the end of the day she felt the first fragile threads of connection being established. That evening they dined together for the first time since the wedding, another shift in their careful routine. Mrs. Dawson served a simple meal in the smaller dining room, a space that felt almost intimate compared to the formal grandeur elsewhere in the house. "You did well today," Alaric said as they ate. "I asked questions and nodded appropriately," Clara replied. "Hardly a significant achievement. You listened as if their answers mattered. You would be surprised how rare that is among those who hold power." He paused, studying her across the table. "You understand what we are building here? A succession that cannot be challenged," Clara said. "A structure of governance so firmly established that Malcolm will have no leverage to dismantle it. More than that." Alaric set down his fork. "A way of exercising power that acknowledges responsibility rather than denying it. My father ruled through distance and authority. Malcolm would rule through extraction and exploitation. I am trying to build something different, governance based on mutual obligation. The tenants provide labor and loyalty, we provide protection and fairness. It only works if both sides honor the compact." Clara considered this. "You are attempting to create a moral framework for the exercise of inherited power. Most of your peers would consider that absurd." "Most of my peers are parasites." The words came out with unexpected vehemence. "They inherited land and wealth and use both to sustain their own comfort while contributing nothing of value. I do not have time to waste on such emptiness." The reference to time, to his limited time, hung between them like a weight. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of this man she had married. He was not merely trying to prevent Malcolm from inheriting. He was trying to build something that would outlast him, a structure of governance that would protect these people after he was gone. "How long," she asked quietly, "how long do the physicians truly believe you have?" Alaric was silent for a long moment. 18 months, perhaps 2 years. There is damage from Waterloo beyond what is visible. Internal injuries that did not heal properly, complications that worsen slowly but inevitably. "Does it cause you pain?" "Constantly." He said it matter-of-factly as if discussing the weather. "Garrett provides tonics that help, but there is a limit to what can be managed." Clara felt an unexpected surge of anger at the injustice of it, that this man who was trying to build something meaningful should be given so little time to complete it. "Then we must work faster." "What comes next?" "Next," Alaric said, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken, "we must fulfill the primary purpose of this arrangement. A marriage without consummation has no legal weight if challenged. A pregnancy provides proof that cannot be easily dismissed." The words hung in the air between them, transforming the atmosphere from professional to something far more complex. Clara set down her wine glass with careful precision. "I understand," she said quietly. "When?" "That," Alaric replied, his voice equally quiet, "is your decision. I will not force this, Clara. The arrangement requires consent, ongoing and genuine." She looked at him across the table, this scarred stranger who had given her power, who had listened to her conditions, who was trying to build something worth protecting. The idea of physical intimacy with him did not repel her, which was perhaps the most surprising discovery of all. "Tonight," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "We have delayed long enough." Clara prepared herself in the Duchess's chambers with the methodical calm she brought to difficult tasks. Mrs. Dawson had laid out a nightgown, fine linen, modest but of quality that spoke to the household's attention to detail. Clara dismissed the maid who had come to help her undress, preferring to manage this transition alone, without witnesses to her nervousness. She understood the mechanics of what was to occur. Her mother, in one of her last lucid conversations before illness claimed her, had explained the essential facts with clinical precision. But understanding mechanics and facing reality were different species of knowledge entirely. A soft knock at the connecting door between their chambers. Clara drew a breath, steadied herself and opened it. Alaric stood in the doorway wearing a dark dressing gown, his hair slightly damp as if he had recently washed. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, making the scar more pronounced. He made no attempt to position himself to hide it, and Clara appreciated that small honesty. "May I enter?" he asked, as formal as if requesting entry to an office rather than a wife's bedchamber. "Yes." Clara stepped back, allowing him passage into the room. The fire burned low in the grate, casting everything in warm, uncertain light. They stood for a moment in awkward silence, two people bound by law and necessity, about to cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Alaric moved first, crossing to the window and drawing the curtains, not for modesty Clara realized but to ensure complete privacy. "I want you to understand something," he said, turning back to face her. "What happens here tonight is not merely transaction. You're my wife. I will treat you with the respect that entails." "I know." Clara found her voice steadier than expected. "You have shown me nothing but respect since I arrived. I also want you to understand that I am not." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I am not experienced in providing comfort or tenderness. The injury at Waterloo, the recovery afterward, there has been little room in my life for such things." The admission surprised her with its vulnerability. This man who commanded an estate, who governed with such competence, was confessing uncertainty in this particular arena. Clara felt something soften in her chest. "Then we are matched in inexperience," she said quietly. "I have never. This will be my first time." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps or a reassessment. "I assumed given your age." "You assumed I might have already compromised myself?" Clara could not help the slight edge that entered her voice. "Even desperation has its limits, Your Grace." "Alaric," he corrected gently. "And I meant no insult. Merely that I will proceed with greater care, knowing this." He approached slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. When he stood before her, close enough that she could see the pale lines of scarring that extended below his collar, he raised his right hand, the one still intact, and touched her face with surprising gentleness. "You do not flinch," he observed. "Why would I?" Clara met his eyes directly. "You are scarred, not monstrous. There is a difference." She saw the impact of her words in the way his expression changed, in the breath he drew as if she had said something extraordinary rather than merely truthful. His hand moved from her face to her hair, unpinning it slowly until it fell around her shoulders. "You are more beautiful than I realized," he said quietly, and Clara understood that he meant it not as flattery but as genuine observation. "I am ordinary," she replied. "But I thank you for the kindness." "You are remarkable," he corrected. "Beauty is merely an accident of arrangement. Remarkable is what you do with what you are given." He kissed her then, carefully, as if she were something that might break under rough handling. Clara had nothing to compare it to, but it felt right, neither too aggressive nor too tentative. She found herself responding, her hands moving to his shoulders, feeling the solid reality of him beneath the fabric of his dressing gown. What followed was conducted in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and their breathing. Alaric was careful, attentive to her comfort in ways that suggested he was suppressing his own urgency for her sake. There was pain, brief, sharp, and then adjustment as her body accommodated his presence. Clara focused on breathing, on remaining present rather than retreating into analytical distance. When it was finished, Alaric withdrew carefully and lay beside her, not touching but present. Clara stared at the canopy above them, processing what had just occurred. It had been neither the clinical transaction she had braced herself for, nor the romantic fantasy she had read about in novels. It had been something else entirely, an act of mutual vulnerability, performed with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. "Are you well?" Alaric asked after a moment. "Yes." Clara turned her head to look at him. "You were considerate." "That is a tepid recommendation of my performance," he observed, and Clara was startled to hear something that might have been humor in his tone. "I have no basis for comparison," she replied, and felt an unexpected smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps you were extraordinary. I shall have to conduct extensive research to determine the appropriate assessment." This time she was certain. He laughed, quietly but genuinely. "Research? You would approach even this as an administrative problem requiring study." I approach everything that way, Clara said. It has served me well thus far. They lay in comfortable silence for several minutes. Clara expected Alaric to return to his own chambers. That seemed the appropriate protocol for such arrangements. Instead, he remained, his breathing gradually evening into something approaching relaxation. Tell me about Waterloo, Clara said quietly. Not the battle itself, but what came after. Alaric was silent for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured, describing not glory but chaos. The field hospital, the surgeon who saved his life while taking his fingers, the fever that lasted weeks, the slow realization that his face would bear permanent witness to what he had survived. I returned to find my father dying, he continued. He had perhaps 3 months remaining. Not enough time to properly prepare me for what governance required, only enough to outline the essential facts and warn me about Malcolm's ambitions. I have been learning through necessity ever since. As have I, Clara said. Perhaps that is what binds us. We are both attempting to become adequate to circumstances we never anticipated. More than adequate, Alaric said, turning to face her. You have the potential to be exceptional at this, Clara. Do not underestimate yourself. The words settled over her like a benediction. In her entire life, no one had suggested she might be exceptional at anything beyond survival. The possibility that she might build something larger than mere endurance felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Will you stay? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Tonight, I mean. I find I prefer not to be alone. Yes. Alaric reached out, taking her hand in his damaged one. I will stay. They slept that way, hands joined, two people bound by necessity beginning to discover something that might, against all odds, resemble partnership. Outside, the spring night deepened toward dawn, and within Clara's body, cells divided and multiplied, beginning the transformation that would determine all their futures. 6 weeks later, Dr. Garrett confirmed what Clara's body had already suggested. She was pregnant. The news was delivered in the same office where she had been working through tenant complaints, the physician's expression carefully neutral as he pronounced the verdict that would reshape everything. You are certain? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Quite certain, Your Grace. I would estimate you are approximately 6 weeks along. All signs suggest a healthy pregnancy thus far. Garrett closed his medical bag with practiced efficiency. You must take care not to overtax yourself. Rest, proper nutrition, moderate exercise only. Clara nodded, though the advice seemed absurd given the work that remained. She had 6 months, perhaps 7, before the child arrived. 7 months to ensure that her position was unassailable, that the network of loyalties and legal protections was strong enough to withstand Malcolm's inevitable assault. After Garrett departed, Clara sat alone in the office, one hand resting unconsciously on her still flat abdomen. A child. The abstract promise of the arrangement had become concrete reality, cells multiplying into a person who would inherit everything they were building. The responsibility of it felt immense. Alaric found her there an hour later, surrounded by papers she had been staring at without reading. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him. Garrett told me, he said simply. Are you well? Yes. Clara looked up at him. Overwhelmed but well. He crossed to her, and in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks, placed his hand gently on her shoulder. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, not romance precisely, but a deep mutual respect that occasionally manifested in careful touches, in conversations that extended late into the night, in the decision to continue sharing a bed even when conception no longer required it. We need to accelerate the timeline, Clara said, refocusing on practicalities. Malcolm must not learn of this until after the birth, but we must ensure that when he does, our position is legally and practically impregnable. Agreed. Alaric moved to the desk, pulling out a map marked with the estate boundaries. I have been thinking about the school you mentioned, the one in the village that has been closed for 15 years. Reopening it would demonstrate commitment to the tenants' welfare and establish you as an active governor rather than merely my wife. Clara studied the map. The building requires significant repair. The cost would be substantial. The cost of not reopening it is higher, Alaric replied. Education is the only reliable path out of inherited poverty. If we want these people's genuine loyalty rather than mere obligation, we must invest in their children's futures. It was precisely the kind of thinking that had drawn Clara to respect him. Alaric governed not through sentiment but through a hard-eyed assessment of what genuine responsibility required. She stood, moving to examine the map more closely. Then I should visit the site, assess what repairs are necessary, and develop a proposal for staffing and curriculum. Her mind was already cataloging tasks, calculating timelines. If we begin work within the month, the school could potentially open by autumn. Before the child is born, Alaric observed. Establishing you as a force independent of me. Yes. Clara met his gaze. When you die, Alaric, there must be no question that I am capable of governing without you. The school is evidence of that capability. He flinched slightly at her directness. She had noticed he preferred to avoid explicit discussion of his approaching death. But he did not contradict her. There is something else, he said quietly. Malcolm has written requesting a visit. He claims it is merely familial courtesy, but it is reconnaissance, Clara finished. He wants to assess whether there have been changes, whether your reclusiveness has lessened, whether there are vulnerabilities he can exploit. Precisely. Alaric's expression darkened. I can refuse, but that merely delays the inevitable and suggests we have something to hide. Clara considered this. Then we receive him. But carefully. He sees what we want him to see, a duke in declining health, a quiet household, nothing to suggest any significant changes. I remain invisible. You hide, Alaric said flatly. I am strategic, Clara corrected. There is no benefit to revealing my presence prematurely. Let Malcolm believe everything remains as it was. When he learns the truth, it should be too late for effective countermeasures. Alaric studied her for a long moment. You have a talent for this, for seeing power as a game of positioning and timing. I have a talent for survival, Clara replied. This is merely survival conducted at a different scale. He moved closer, his hand finding hers. It is more than survival, Clara. What we are building here, it matters. Not just for the child, but for everyone who depends on this estate. I know. She squeezed his hand gently. Which is why we cannot afford mistakes. Malcolm's visit must be managed perfectly. Then we shall manage it, Alaric said. Together. Malcolm Blackwood arrived on a gray afternoon in late May, his carriage announcing itself with polished elegance that stood in deliberate contrast to the austere functionality of Blackwood Hall. Clara watched from an upper window as he descended, tall, handsome in a way that suggested careful cultivation, his clothing fashionable without excess. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself destined for greater things. She withdrew before he could glance upward, retreating to the suite of rooms that would be her domain for the next 3 days. The arrangement had been carefully orchestrated. Clara would remain hidden, take meals in her chambers, conduct no business that might draw attention. To all appearances, the household would seem exactly as it had been for the past 2 years, a reclusive duke managing his estates in solitary efficiency. Mrs. Dawson brought her dinner that evening along with quiet intelligence gathered from the servants. Mr. Malcolm has been asking questions, the housekeeper reported, her voice low. About His Grace's health, about household expenditures, about whether there have been any visitors of note. And the staff responses? Clara asked. Exactly as rehearsed. His Grace remains in declining health but manages adequately. No visitors beyond the usual tenants and tradespeople. All quite dull and predictable. Mrs. Dawson permitted herself a slight smile. Though I will say, Your Grace, Mr. Malcolm has a way of making even innocent questions feel like interrogation. Clara could imagine it, the charming smile deployed as a weapon, the casual inquiries designed to uncover vulnerability. She spent the evening reviewing documents, deliberately avoiding any work that might require consultation with Alaric. They could not risk unexpected encounters, could not allow Malcolm even a glimpse of their partnership. The following afternoon, Clara heard voices in the garden below her window. She moved the curtain fractionally, just enough to observe without being seen. Alaric and Malcolm walked the grounds together, Malcolm gesturing expansively while Alaric maintained his characteristic reserve. You have let the East Garden become overgrown, Malcolm's voice drifted upward, carrying the particular tone of criticism disguised as concern. Father would have been disappointed. Father is dead, Alaric replied flatly. The East Garden is low priority compared to tenant housing and agricultural infrastructure. Still prioritizing the tenants over proper estate maintenance. Malcolm shook his head with theatrical sadness. One day you will understand that appearances matter, cousin. A duke who allows his own grounds to deteriorate signals weakness. A duke who allows his tenants to suffer while maintaining ornamental gardens signals moral bankruptcy. Alaric's voice carried an edge now. We clearly have different philosophies of governance. Indeed. Malcolm's tone shifted, becoming more pointed. Tell me, have you given any more thought to marriage? The family line requires securing. At your age, with your condition, delay becomes increasingly irresponsible. Clara's breath caught. This was the real purpose of the visit. Not reconnaissance about estate management but about succession. Malcolm was probing, testing whether Alaric had made any moves to secure an heir. My personal affairs are my own concern, Alaric said coldly. When those affairs affect the entire Blackwood legacy, they become family concern. Malcolm stopped walking, forcing Alaric to face him. You are dying, Alaric. We both know it. If you will not marry and produce an heir, the responsible course is to begin preparing me for the transition. I could begin assuming some administrative duties, familiarize myself with the tenants and operations. No. The word was absolute. I am not yet deceased, Malcolm, and I remain entirely capable of managing my own estates. For how long? Malcolm's mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine frustration beneath the polished concern. 6 months? A year? You are being selfish, cousin. Your pride is preventing proper planning for this estate's future. What I am preventing, Alaric said quietly, is you transforming these lands into another revenue source to fund your London ambitions. I know exactly what you would do here, Malcolm. I have seen how you manage your own properties. They stood in tense silence, two men separated by blood and philosophy. Finally, Malcolm smiled, a gesture that contained no warmth whatsoever. Very well. Continue your isolation, your decline, your stubborn refusal to face reality. But understand this, when you die, I will inherit. And I will govern as I see fit, regardless of whatever sentimental arrangements you have attempted to establish. He paused, his smile sharpening. Unless, of course, you have some secret plan you have not shared. But what could that possibly be? The question hung in the air, laden with suspicion. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Malcolm did not know, but he suspected something. His instincts sensed a gap in the information available to him. I have no secrets, Alaric lied smoothly. Merely the determination to govern competently for whatever time remains to me. Now, if you will excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to. He walked away, leaving Malcolm standing in the garden, his expression thoughtful and dangerous. Clara watched as he slowly surveyed the house, his gaze moving across windows as if trying to penetrate stone and glass to uncover what he sensed but could not prove. After Malcolm departed the following morning, Clara emerged from seclusion to find Alaric in the library, staring into the fire with an expression of profound weariness. He suspects, she said quietly. Yes. Alaric did not turn from the flames. He does not know what, but he suspects something. We must move faster, Clara. The school, the legal documents, everything that establishes your position. It all must be completed before my condition worsens further. Clara moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Then we work faster. Whatever time we have, we use it completely. He pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that had become natural between them. I am sorry, he said quietly. I have brought you into something far more complicated than you agreed to. You brought me into something meaningful, Clara corrected. That is worth the complexity. Summer arrived with unusual heat, and Clara's pregnancy became visible enough that her dresses required alteration. Mrs. Dawson managed this with discretion, ensuring that the few staff members who knew the truth understood the vital importance of silence. The household had become a conspiracy of loyalty, bound together by shared knowledge and the understanding that they were protecting something larger than themselves. The village school consumed Clara's attention through June and July. She had underestimated both the scope of the repairs needed and her own capacity for managing complex projects. The roof required complete replacement, the windows had to be reglazed, the floors sanded and refinished. She hired local workers, creating employment that further cemented tenant loyalty, and oversaw every detail personally despite Dr. Garrett's protests about overexertion. You are carrying a child, Your Grace, he reminded her during one of his weekly examinations. Not building a cathedral. I am building a legacy, Clara corrected, wincing as the child kicked vigorously. The cathedral can wait. By August the school was ready. Clara had recruited a young teacher from York, Miss Elizabeth Ward, a woman of serious demeanor and genuine pedagogical skill who asked no questions about why a duchess would personally involve herself in village education. The opening ceremony was attended by every tenant family, their children scrubbed and nervous, their parents cautiously hopeful. Clara stood before them, visibly pregnant now, and spoke with the authority she had cultivated over 5 months of governance. Education is not charity, she said clearly. It is investment in this community's future. Your children will learn reading, mathematics, history, and practical skills. They will have opportunities beyond what accident of birth might otherwise allow. This is what good governance requires, not extraction but cultivation. She saw John Carver nodding, saw other tenants exchanging glances that suggested assessment and approval. When Alaric spoke afterward, his remarks were brief but pointed. "The Duchess has made this possible," he said. "Remember that. What she builds here will outlast me." The message was clear to those with ears to hear it. Clara was not merely the Duke's wife, but a governor in her own right. When Alaric died, she would not be a placeholder but a continuation of what had been established. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Alaric's breathing was labored in a way that had become increasingly common. The decline Dr. Garrett had predicted was accelerating. Clara felt the child move within her, a reminder that time was collapsing toward convergence. One life ending as another began. "I may not live to see the birth," Alaric said quietly, voicing what they had both been thinking but not speaking. "Garrett believes I have perhaps 4 months remaining, possibly less." Clara's hand tightened on his. "Then we must complete everything now. The legal documents, the letters to Lord Pemberton and your other allies, the formal announcements prepared for after the birth. Nothing can be left to chance." "I have prepared letters," Alaric said, "to be delivered upon my death. They explain everything, the marriage, the pregnancy, the reasons for secrecy. Whitmore has copies secured in 3 separate locations. Malcolm will not be able to suppress the truth." "And the child?" Clara asked. "If you do not survive the birth, then you govern as regent until he or she reaches majority. Every legal protection possible has been established. You will have allies, Pemberton, Whitmore, Dr. Garrett, several others who believe in what we are building. Malcolm will challenge, but he will lose." Clara absorbed this, fighting the unexpected grief rising in her chest. She had not anticipated growing to care for this scarred, complicated man. Their arrangement had been transactional, yet somewhere in the shared work and quiet conversations, something genuine had developed between them. "I do not want you to die," she said, the words escaping before she could consider whether they should be spoken. "I know." His voice was gentle. "I do not want to die either. But I am grateful, Clara, that whatever time I had left was spent building this with you rather than facing the darkness alone." They held each other in the silence that followed, 2 people bound by necessity discovering too late that they had found something rare. Partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. The injustice of time made the moment both precious and unbearable. September arrived with cooler air and the first hints of autumn color. Clara was immense now, the child positioned low and active. Dr. Garrett estimated perhaps 6 more weeks until birth. Alaric had declined precipitously. He could no longer ride, could barely manage the stairs, spent most days in the office working through sheer determination despite obvious pain. "You should rest," Clara told him as he struggled through correspondence one afternoon. "I will rest when I am dead," he replied with dark humor. "Until then there is work." But 2 days later he collapsed while meeting with tenants. Clara was there, saw him grasp the desk for support before his legs simply gave way. Dr. Garrett was summoned immediately, his examination brief and conclusive. "His Grace must remain abed," Garrett said bluntly. "The end is approaching faster than anticipated. Perhaps weeks, not months." Clara sat beside Alaric's bed that evening watching him sleep fitfully. The child kicked insistently as if aware that time was running out. She placed her hand on her abdomen, making a silent promise. Whatever happened, she would protect this life, would govern these lands, would complete what she and Alaric had begun. Tomorrow she would meet with the tenants alone. Tomorrow she would begin the final transition from Duchess in training to Duchess in fact. But tonight she simply sat vigil, bearing witness to a good man's fading, grieving the loss of something she had found too late to fully explore. Alaric died 3 weeks later, on a rain-swept October morning, with Clara holding his hand. He had been unconscious for 2 days, his breathing shallow and labored, his body finally surrendering to injuries sustained years ago on a battlefield far from home. Dr. Garrett had administered morphine to ease the pain, and in his final lucid moments, Alaric had looked at Clara with something that might have been peace. "You will be extraordinary," he whispered. "Protect them. Protect our child." "I will," Clara promised. "I swear it." He died at dawn, the light just beginning to touch the horizon. Clara sat beside his body for a long moment, one hand on her swollen belly where their child kicked vigorously, oblivious to the loss. She felt grief, yes, but also a terrible clarity. The work could not pause for mourning. Malcolm would move quickly once news reached him. She had to move faster. By noon, Whitmore had arrived with the sealed documents. Letters were dispatched to Lord Pemberton and Alaric's other allies, announcing both the Duke's death and the existence of his widow, married quietly 6 months prior, now 7 months pregnant with the heir. The marriage certificate was registered formally with the appropriate authorities, backdated accurately to the April ceremony but only now made public. Malcolm will contest this, Whitmore said as they worked through the legal necessities. He will claim the marriage was fabricated, that the child is illegitimate, that. Let him claim whatever he wishes, Clara interrupted, her voice steady despite exhaustion. We have witnesses, documentation, legal precedent. And we have this. She gestured to the estate ledgers, the school records, the documented improvements and tenant testimonials. Proof that I have been governing competently for months. Malcolm can challenge my legitimacy, but he cannot challenge my effectiveness. The funeral was held 3 days later. The tenants came in numbers that surprised even Clara, not out of obligation but genuine respect for a man who had governed them fairly. Malcolm arrived the night before, his expression carefully arranged in appropriate grief, though his eyes assessed everything with calculating precision. He found Clara in the drawing room that evening, dressed in mourning black that accommodated her pregnancy. She had prepared for this confrontation, had rehearsed what needed to be said. "Cousin," Malcolm said, the word laden with false warmth. "Or should I say, Your Grace? I confess myself astonished to learn of Alaric's marriage. How extraordinary that he kept it secret." "Not secret," Clara corrected calmly. "Private. Given His Grace's declining health, we preferred to manage the situation with discretion." "How convenient." Malcolm's smile was sharp. "A marriage no one knew about, announced only after his death. You must understand how suspicious this appears." "I understand you are disappointed," Clara replied. "You expected to inherit. Unfortunately, that expectation was based on incomplete information." Malcolm's mask slipped slightly. "Who are you? Some governess he found and convinced to participate in this farce? Whatever he promised you, I can double it. Admit the marriage was fabricated, relinquish any claim to the title, and I will ensure you are comfortably settled." "I am the Duchess of Blackwood," Clara said with absolute certainty. "Wife to Alaric Blackwood, mother to his unborn child, and administrator of these estates until that child reaches majority. Those are facts, Mr. Blackwood, not negotiations. We shall see what the courts determine." Malcolm's voice turned cold. "I will contest this with every resource at my disposal. You have no family, no connections, no power beyond what you claim Alaric gave you. Do you truly believe you can stand against me?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Yes. Because I have what you lack, the loyalty of these people and the competence to govern them well. You may have connections in London, Mr. Blackwood, but this is Blackwood Hall, and here I have already won." The truth of it was visible in Malcolm's expression. The realization that he had been outmaneuvered, that while he had been cultivating political alliances in London, Alaric and Clara had been building something more fundamental. Power rooted not in title alone, but in demonstrated governance and mutual obligation. "This is not finished," Malcolm said finally. "No," Clara agreed. "But the outcome is inevitable. You will challenge and you will lose. I suggest you accept that reality and direct your energies elsewhere." After he departed, Clara allowed herself to collapse into a chair, her body trembling with delayed reaction. Mrs. Dawson appeared with tea, her expression sympathetic. "You were magnificent, Your Grace," the housekeeper said quietly. "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "But he cannot know that. He suspects nothing of the sort. You have become what His Grace believed you could be." Mrs. Dawson paused. "He would be proud." Clara felt tears threaten for the first time since Alaric's death. She had not permitted herself to grieve, had pushed emotion aside in favor of necessary action. But Mrs. Dawson's words breached the careful control she had maintained. "I miss him," she whispered. "Which is absurd. I knew him for only 6 months. Yet I miss him. Time is not what creates connection, Your Grace. Shared purpose is." Mrs. Dawson placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "You loved him in your way. That is nothing to apologize for." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She had loved him, not with passion or romance but with the deep respect that comes from partnership in meaningful work. They had built something together and now she would complete it alone. That night, she sat in the office they had shared, surrounded by the administrative apparatus they had constructed together. The child moved vigorously within her, and Clara placed both hands on her abdomen. "Your father was a good man," she said quietly to the life inside her. "He built all of this for you. Now we must protect it." Malcolm filed his legal challenge within a week, exactly as predicted. The documents arrived via courier, thick packets of legal language alleging fraud, deception, and conspiracy. He claimed the marriage was fabricated posthumously, that Clara was an impostor who had exploited a dying man's desperation, that any child she bore could not be proven legitimate. Whitmore reviewed the challenge with professional detachment. "He has engaged Thornhill and Associates," he said, naming one of London's most aggressive legal firms. "They specialize in inheritance disputes and have substantial resources. Do we have sufficient evidence to counter?" Clara asked, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. The child was due in less than 3 weeks, and she could not afford to be consumed by legal battles during delivery. "We have the marriage certificate, witnessed by 5 reputable individuals. We have documented evidence of your residence here and active governance. We have tenant testimonials regarding your competence." Whitmore's expression was cautiously optimistic. "Most importantly, we have Lord Pemberton's support. His testimony alone carries significant weight in these matters." Lord Pemberton had indeed proven invaluable. The elderly aristocrat had known Alaric since childhood and possessed both social standing and political influence. He had written formal letters affirming his presence at the wedding, attesting to Alaric's sound mental state, and vouching for Clara's character. Other witnesses had done likewise, creating a documentary wall of verification. But Malcolm was relentless. Over the following days, Clara learned he had hired investigators to probe her background, searching for anything that might undermine her credibility. They interviewed her former neighbors, questioned tradespeople who had dealt with her family, tracked down anyone who might provide damaging testimony. "They found your father's creditors," Whitmore reported grimly. "Mr. Hendricks in particular has been quite forthcoming about your family's financial desperation. Malcolm's attorneys will argue you married Alaric purely for mercenary reasons, that the entire arrangement was a calculated exploitation of a dying man." Clara felt cold rage crystallize in her chest. "The marriage was indeed calculated," she said quietly. "Alaric and I were both completely honest about what we were creating, a partnership designed to prevent Malcolm from inheriting. That transparency is our strength, not our weakness." "The courts may not see it that way," Whitmore cautioned. "A marriage of convenience can be portrayed as invalid if consent was coerced or obtained under false pretenses. Alaric coerced nothing. He offered terms, I accepted them. Everything was negotiated honestly between 2 competent adults." Clara placed her hand on her abdomen where the child had grown unnaturally still. "And this child is the legitimate heir regardless of how the marriage began." 3 days later, Clara went into labor. It began at midnight with a tightening across her belly that gradually intensified into pain she had not anticipated despite theoretical knowledge. Mrs. Dawson summoned Dr. Garrett immediately, and Clara was moved to the Duchess's chambers where preparations had been made weeks prior. The labor lasted 18 hours. Clara had faced poverty, desperation, and grief with stoic determination, but childbirth tested her in ways nothing else had. The pain came in waves that obliterated thought, leaving only animal endurance. Dr. Garrett's voice guided her through. Mrs. Dawson held her hand, and somewhere in the fog of agony, Clara clung to the single coherent thought: she must survive this, must live to protect what she and Alaric had built. Finally, near dawn, the child emerged, a son, small but vigorous, his cries filling the room with urgent life. Dr. Garrett placed him on Clara's chest, and she looked down at the tiny red-faced creature who represented everything they had fought for. "The Duke of Blackwood," Garrett said formally. "James Alaric Blackwood, if you approve the name you selected." "Yes," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "James. After my father." The baby was cleaned and examined, pronounced healthy despite being slightly premature. Clara was tended to, the aftermath of birth managed with clinical efficiency. By mid-morning, she lay exhausted in clean linens, her son sleeping in a cradle beside her bed, and felt the reality of what had been accomplished settle over her like a weight. She had produced an heir. The succession was secured. Malcolm could challenge all he wished, but this child was legitimate, documented, witnessed, the undeniable son of the Duke of Blackwood. Whitmore arrived that afternoon with documents requiring her signature: the birth registration, naming James as heir to the dukedom and all associated holdings. Clara signed with a hand that still trembled from exhaustion, making her son's existence legally incontrovertible. "Malcolm will receive notification within hours," Whitmore said. He can continue his legal challenge, but the birth significantly weakens his position. A living heir with documented lineage takes precedence over a collateral cousin. How long until the courts resolve this? Clara asked, watching James sleep with fierce protectiveness. Months, possibly a year. These disputes move slowly. Whitmore's expression was sympathetic. But you have time now, Your Grace. Time to consolidate your position, to continue demonstrating competent governance, to make yourself indispensable to this estate's functioning. After he left, Clara lifted James from his cradle, marveling at the tiny perfection of him. He had Alaric's dark hair, though it was impossible to determine yet what other features he might inherit. She thought of the man who had made this possible, who had offered her survival and given her purpose, who had believed she could become extraordinary. Your father never met you, she whispered to the sleeping infant. But he loved you before you existed. He built all of this for you, every legal protection, every alliance, every careful plan. Now we protect it together. James stirred, made a small sound, and Clara felt the mantle of responsibility settle permanently onto her shoulders. She was not merely surviving anymore. She was governing, building, protecting, executing a vision that would outlast them all. Winter settled over Blackwood Hall with unusual severity. Clara spent the first weeks after James's birth in careful recovery, balancing the demands of new motherhood with the necessity of maintaining estate governance. She hired a wet nurse, a practical young woman named Sarah who had recently lost her own infant and was grateful for both employment and purpose, but insisted on remaining involved in James's daily care. He was not merely an heir but her son, and she would not delegate that relationship entirely to servants. Malcolm's legal challenge ground forward through the court system with frustrating slowness. Depositions were taken, documents examined, witnesses questioned. Clara spent hours with Whitmore preparing testimony, reviewing legal precedents, ensuring every aspect of their defense was unassailable. Thornhill is arguing that the marriage was never consummated prior to Alaric's death, Whitmore reported during one strategy session. They claim that without consummation, the marriage lacks validity regardless of documentation. Clara felt heat rise to her face but kept her voice steady. We consummated the marriage the night we agreed to, and multiple times thereafter. How do they imagine James was conceived? They are suggesting. Whitmore cleared his throat uncomfortably. They are suggesting that the child might not be Alaric's, that you could have conceived through other means and claimed the child as legitimate heir. The accusation was so outrageous that Clara laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. They are claiming I fabricated a marriage, convinced 5 respected individuals to commit perjury as witnesses, seduced some unknown man to father a child, and somehow orchestrated all of this while simultaneously learning to govern an estate I had never seen before? The conspiracy they propose would require genius-level manipulation. Which is precisely what makes it difficult to prove false, Whitmore said quietly. You are demonstrably intelligent, Your Grace. The court may find it plausible that you could orchestrate such deception. Clara stood abruptly, moving to the window where snow fell in thick curtains. Then we demonstrate that I had no need for deception. We show the court exactly what Alaric and I built together, the school, the infrastructure improvements, the tenant agreements, the administrative reforms. We prove that I was his true partner in governance, that our arrangement was founded on mutual purpose rather than fraud. That may not be sufficient, Whitmore cautioned. Malcolm has significant support among those who believe estates should pass through male lines regardless of circumstances. They see your position as an aberration, a violation of natural order. Natural order? Clara repeated bitterly. Malcolm would drain these lands to fund his London ambitions while tenants starved. But that is acceptable because he possesses the correct anatomy. Whereas I, who have actually improved conditions and demonstrated competence, am suspect because I lack it. She turned back to face Whitmore. We will win this case not by defending against their accusations, but by making the alternative unthinkable. When the court examines what I have accomplished versus what Malcolm represents, the choice becomes obvious. Over the following months, Clara implemented that strategy with methodical precision. She invited respected observers to tour the estate, see the functioning school, meet with satisfied tenants. She published detailed accounts of estate management showing improved revenues and reduced expenditures. She leveraged Lord Pemberton's connections to ensure that influential members of Parliament were aware of the situation. Most importantly, she governed. Every decision she made was documented, every improvement recorded, every tenant interaction noted. She created an overwhelming body of evidence that she was not merely a placeholder but an active, competent administrator whose removal would damage the estate's functioning. By spring, James was 6 months old, a healthy, vigorous child who smiled readily and showed no ill effects from his premature birth. Clara had him presented formally to the tenants during the May Day celebration, a calculated demonstration of continuity and stability. She stood before the gathered families holding James, her voice clear and confident. "This is your future Duke. His father built the foundation, I maintain it, he will inherit it. That is the order of succession, legally established and morally justified. Anyone who seeks to disrupt that order opposes not just me, but all of you and the stability we have created together." The response was overwhelming. John Carver spoke for the tenants, declaring their loyalty to the Duchess and her son, their opposition to any attempt to install Malcolm as Duke. Other tenants echoed the sentiment, creating a groundswell of public support that Clara knew would reach the court. That evening, after James had been put to bed, Clara sat in Alaric's office, her office now, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had been Duchess for 8 months, mother for 6. She had survived childbirth, legal challenges and Malcolm's relentless attempts to undermine her position. She had governed competently through all of it. Mrs. Dawson found her there, brought tea without being asked. "You are thinking of him," the housekeeper observed. "Yes." Clara did not attempt to deny it. "Wondering if what we have built is what he envisioned." "It is more," Mrs. Dawson said firmly. "His Grace gave you the opportunity and the tools. But what you have made of them exceeds anything he could have anticipated. You have become extraordinary just as he believed you would." Clara felt the familiar ache of grief mixed with pride. Alaric had not lived to see his son, had not witnessed what Clara had accomplished. But his faith in her had been justified, his careful planning vindicated. "The court hearing is scheduled for June," she said quietly. "Whitmore believes we have a strong case, but nothing is certain." "You will prevail," Mrs. Dawson said with absolute conviction. "Not because of legal technicalities, but because you have proven yourself indispensable. They cannot remove you without damaging everything you have built." Clara hoped she was right. But she also knew that courts had their own logic, their own prejudices. Until the judgment was delivered, nothing was secure. She stood, moving to the portrait of Alaric that hung above the fireplace, painted years before Waterloo, showing him young and unscarred. "I will protect what we built," she promised quietly. "Whatever it requires." The court hearing took place in London in mid-June, in a chamber heavy with wood paneling and centuries of legal precedent. Clara arrived with Whitmore, Lord Pemberton, and Dr. Garrett, her primary witnesses and advocates. Malcolm sat across the aisle with his attorneys, his expression confident in a way that made Clara's stomach tighten with anxiety. James she had left at Blackwood Hall with Mrs. Dawson and Sarah, refusing to bring an infant into what would likely be a prolonged and contentious proceeding. The separation was painful but necessary. She needed complete focus for what was to come. The presiding judges were 3 men of advanced age and conservative bearing: Lord Justice Hartwell, Justice Brennan, and Justice Cole. They listened with stern attention as Malcolm's attorney, Mr. Thornhill, presented the challenge with theatrical precision. "This case concerns the sanctity of inheritance law and the protection of noble estates from fraudulent manipulation," Thornhill declared. "The evidence will show that Miss Clara Hewitt, for that is her true name, not the title she falsely claims, exploited a dying man's desperation to fabricate a marriage and produce an heir of questionable legitimacy." He presented their case methodically: Clara's desperate financial circumstances, the convenient timing of the marriage announcement, the lack of public knowledge about the union, the suspicious privacy surrounding the entire arrangement. He called witnesses who testified to the Hewitt family's debts, to Clara's precarious position before her sudden elevation to Duchess. "This woman," Thornhill said, gesturing toward Clara with theatrical disdain, "is either a brilliant opportunist who deceived a dying duke, or she is complicit in a conspiracy orchestrated by the late Duke himself to circumvent proper succession. Either scenario invalidates her claim and that of her alleged son." When it came time for Clara's defense, Whitmore stood with calm authority. "The petitioner's narrative requires us to believe that 5 respected witnesses committed perjury, that a dying man of sound mind was somehow deceived or coerced, and that the substantial improvements to the Blackwood estate under her Grace's administration were accomplished through fraudulent means. This is not a case of deception, my lords. This is a case of unconventional but entirely legal succession planning." Lord Pemberton testified first, his aristocratic bearing and unimpeachable reputation lending weight to every word. "I have known the Blackwood family for 40 years. I witnessed Alaric's marriage to Miss Hewitt personally. He was of completely sound mind, acting of his own free will, entering into an arrangement that he believed would protect his estate from mismanagement. Dr. Garrett followed, providing clinical testimony about Alaric's health, his mental competence, and the medical evidence of Clara's pregnancy timeline. The child was conceived in April, approximately 2 weeks after the marriage. The dates are consistent with His Grace being the father. But the most powerful testimony came when Clara herself took the stand. Thornhill approached her like a predator circling prey. "Miss Hewitt, you were facing complete financial ruin when you agreed to this arrangement, were you not?" "Mrs. Blackwood," Clara corrected calmly. "Or Your Grace if you prefer formality. And yes, I was in desperate circumstances. His Grace knew that. It was precisely why he chose me. Because you would agree to anything for financial security? Because I understood what it meant to fight for survival and would not squander the opportunity he offered." Clara met Thornhill's gaze directly. His Grace did not want a wife who would be decorative and passive. He wanted someone who would govern competently after his death. He chose me because my desperation had taught me competence. "How convenient," Thornhill sneered. "And we are simply to believe that a dying duke, isolated and unwell, made this decision rationally?" "His Grace was dying, not incompetent," Clara said sharply. "He understood exactly what he was doing, preventing his estate from passing to a cousin who would exploit it for personal gain. Everything he did was calculated to protect the people who depended on him." "And you? What were your calculations, Miss Hewitt?" "I calculated that marriage to a dying man was preferable to destitution," Clara said bluntly. "I will not apologize for that. But I also calculated that if I accepted his offer, I would honor it completely, not merely bearing an heir, but learning to govern competently, building relationships with tenants, demonstrating that I could fulfill the role he envisioned for me." She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying throughout the silent chamber. "His Grace offered me survival. In return, I have given these estates the best governance they have seen in decades. That is the transaction we made, and I have fulfilled my end of it completely." The hearing continued for 3 days. Tenants from Blackwood Hall traveled to London to testify, John Carver speaking eloquently about improved conditions, others describing Clara's competence and fairness. The schoolteacher Miss Ward provided testimony about the educational reforms. Even Mrs. Dawson appeared, her housekeeper's perspective lending intimate credibility to the narrative of Clara's genuine partnership with Alaric. Malcolm himself testified on the final day, his charm deployed to maximum effect as he painted himself as the rightful heir being displaced by conspiracy. "I bear no ill will toward Miss Hewitt personally," he said with false magnanimity. "But the law exists to prevent exactly this sort of irregular succession. If we allow estates to be manipulated through deathbed marriages of convenience, we undermine the entire foundation of inheritance law." When all testimony was complete, the judges retired to deliberate. Clara, Whitmore, and Lord Pemberton waited in a private room, the tension nearly unbearable. "You testified beautifully," Pemberton said. "You presented yourself exactly as Alaric would have wished, competent, honest, unashamed of the arrangement's practical nature. But will it be sufficient?" Clara asked. "That," Whitmore said quietly, "depends on whether the judges believe law should serve justice or merely precedent." They waited 3 hours before being summoned back to the chamber. Clara's heart hammered as she stood before the bench, watching Lord Justice Hartwell prepare to deliver the judgment that would determine everything. Lord Justice Hartwell's expression was inscrutable as he surveyed the chamber. The silence was absolute, every person present understanding that centuries of precedent and one woman's future hung on the words about to be spoken. "This court has considered the evidence presented by both parties," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "The petitioner argues that the marriage between the late Duke of Blackwood and Miss Clara Hewitt was fraudulent or invalid, and therefore any issue from that union cannot be recognized as legitimate heir. The respondent maintains that the marriage was legal, properly witnessed, and entered into by 2 consenting adults of sound mind." Clara's hands clenched in her lap, hidden by the folds of her dress. Beside her, Whitmore sat perfectly still. "The law regarding marriage," Hartwell continued, "is clear. A valid marriage requires consent, proper witnesses and consummation. All 3 elements have been demonstrated to this court's satisfaction. 5 witnesses of good reputation testified to the ceremony. Medical evidence supports consummation and subsequent conception. The late Duke's mental competence at the time of marriage has been established beyond reasonable doubt." Clara felt a flicker of hope, but Hartwell was not finished. However, the petitioner raises a more nuanced concern, that marriages of convenience, particularly those arranged in contemplation of death for the explicit purpose of altering succession, may violate the spirit if not the letter of inheritance law. This court must balance respect for individual autonomy against the need to protect estates from manipulation. He paused, and in that silence Clara heard her entire future trembling. Having considered these competing interests, this court finds as follows. The marriage between Alaric Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood, and Clara Hewitt was legal and valid. The child James Alaric Blackwood is the legitimate son and heir of the late Duke. The respondent, Clara Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood, is recognized as legal guardian and administrator of the estate during her son's minority. Relief crashed through Clara with such force that she momentarily felt faint. Whitmore's hand found hers under the table, squeezed once in shared triumph. But Hartwell continued, his tone sharpening. This court also finds, however, that the circumstances of this marriage, while legal, represent precisely the sort of irregular succession planning that invites dispute and uncertainty. We therefore issue the following directives. First, the Duchess of Blackwood will submit annual accountings of estate management to this court for review until the young Duke reaches majority. Second, a panel of trustees including Lord Pemberton and 2 other individuals appointed by this court will provide oversight of major estate decisions. Third, should the Duchess remarry before her son reaches majority, guardianship will be transferred to the trustee panel. Clara absorbed these restrictions with mixed feelings. They were limitations on her authority certainly, but they also represented validation. The court had affirmed her legitimacy while imposing reasonable safeguards. It was not complete victory, but it was victory nonetheless. The petition is denied, Hartwell concluded. This matter is resolved. Court is adjourned. Malcolm's face was a mask of barely controlled fury as he stood. He looked at Clara across the aisle, and she met his gaze with calm certainty. He had lost. Whatever legal challenges remained, the fundamental question had been answered. She was the Duchess, James was the heir, and Malcolm would never govern Blackwood Hall. Outside the courthouse, Lord Pemberton embraced Clara with paternal warmth. Well done, my dear. Alaric would be immensely proud. The restrictions, Clara began. Are nothing, Pemberton interrupted. Annual accountings? You keep meticulous records already. Trustee oversight? I'm named and I trust you completely. The remarriage clause is the only true limitation, and I suspect you have no interest in remarrying anyway. He was right. Clara had no intention of seeking another husband. Her marriage to Alaric had been unique, a partnership of mutual respect and shared purpose. She would not attempt to replicate it. The journey back to Blackwood Hall took 2 days. Clara spent them staring out the carriage window, processing what had been accomplished. 1 year ago she had been Clara Hewitt, impoverished and desperate, her future a void of uncertainty. Now she was the Duchess of Blackwood, legal guardian to a duke, administrator of vast estates, and architect of reforms that would outlast her lifetime. When the carriage finally approached Blackwood Hall, Clara saw tenants lining the drive, not ordered to be there but present by choice. As she descended, they broke into spontaneous applause. John Carver stepped forward, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. Welcome home, Your Grace. We heard the news. Justice was done. Justice was done, Clara echoed, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. And now the real work continues. Inside, Mrs. Dawson waited with James, who at 8 months old was beginning to crawl with determined enthusiasm. Clara swept him into her arms, burying her face in his soft hair, breathing in the scent of him. We won, she whispered. You are the Duke of Blackwood, legitimately and legally. Everything your father built is yours. That evening, after James was asleep, Clara stood in the office that had become the center of her world. She moved to Alaric's portrait, studying the young man he had been before war and injury had marked him. We did it, she said quietly to the painted image. What you started I have secured. James will inherit not just title and land, but a functioning estate with loyal tenants and sustainable practices. The school will educate generations. The improvements will endure. Malcolm is defeated. She paused, gathering words for what needed to be said. I loved you, Alaric. Not at first. At first it was pure transaction. But somewhere in those months of working together, of building something meaningful, I came to love you. Not with passion, perhaps, but with something deeper. Respect that became affection, partnership that became genuine connection. I wish you had lived to see what we accomplished. I wish you had known your son. Tears fell freely now, grief she had suppressed for months finally finding release. She had not allowed herself to mourn during the legal battle. There had been no room for weakness, no space for vulnerability. But now, with victory secured and the future certain, she could finally acknowledge the loss. She wept for the man who had seen her potential when she could not, who had offered her not just survival but purpose, who had believed she could become extraordinary. She wept for the partnership that had been cut short, for the friendship that had only begun to deepen when death claimed him. She wept for James, who would never know his father except through stories and portraits. When the tears finally subsided, Clara felt something shift within her, a resolution hardening into permanent form. She would not merely maintain what Alaric had started. She would expand it, refine it, make Blackwood Hall a model of enlightened estate management. She would raise James to understand that title conferred not privilege but responsibility. She would prove beyond any doubt that Alaric's faith in her had been justified. Years later, when James was grown and preparing to assume full governance, he would ask his mother about his father. Clara would take him to this office, show him the portrait and tell him the truth, that Alaric Blackwood had been a man who understood that good governance required sacrifice, that legacy mattered more than comfort, and that sometimes the most honorable thing one could do was to acknowledge one's limitations and plan accordingly. She would tell James that his father had been dying when they married, that the arrangement had been calculated and practical, but that calculation had not precluded genuine respect and partnership. She would tell him that Alaric had built the foundation, but that she had completed the structure, and that now it was James's responsibility to maintain and improve what they had created together. But that conversation was years in the future. For now, Clara simply stood in the quiet office, hand resting on her abdomen where no life grew now but where once a duke had been conceived in an act of mutual survival. She thought of poverty and desperation, of a scarred duke's desperate gambit, of a marriage that had saved them both. "Thank you," she whispered to the portrait, to the memory, to the man who had changed everything. "Thank you for seeing what I could become. I will not waste what you gave me." She turned then, extinguished the lamps, and walked through the darkened house toward her chambers. Outside, Blackwood Hall settled into night. Tenants sleeping in improved cottages, children dreaming of school lessons tomorrow, land being managed sustainably for generations yet unborn. Clara Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood, had been born from desperation and calculation. But she had become something her younger self could never have imagined. A governor, a protector, a builder of legacy. Not through noble birth or inherited advantage, but through the determination to honor an agreement with a dying man who had believed in her potential. The story that had begun with survival had transformed into something far greater. Purpose, competence, and the quiet triumph of proving that extraordinary could be built from the humblest materials, given opportunity and will. And in the nursery down the hall, James Alaric Blackwood, 8th Duke of Blackwood, slept peacefully, unaware that his entire existence was the culmination of careful planning, desperate necessity, and two people's determination to build something that would outlast them both. The future was secured. The work would continue. And Clara, who had once had nothing, now had everything that truly mattered: purpose, legacy, and the knowledge that she had transformed survival into triumph.